Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar on the state of salary and jobs in privacy. This is a webinar that follows on from a flagship report that the IAPP was delighted to produce with TRU Staffing Partners. We published it last week, and if you have not read it, please do. We're going to be going over the key highlights, the headlines, the top reflections and actionable insights from that report, and our wider insights into the market on the state of salary and jobs in the market. My name is Joe Jones. I'm the Director of Research and Insights at the IAPP. I direct the team responsible for, funnily enough, the research that the IAPP produces in the field of privacy. Important to that is how organizations are set up, how they govern themselves, and how the professionals within the privacy community are set up. The mission of the IAPP is to define, support, and promote the privacy profession. I'm so delighted to introduce my colleague Saz. He's in the research team. He's our principal researcher for privacy management, leading all of that work. You will see him and he's popping up here on the screen. He's responsible for our work, not only on salary, but on governance, on risk. He's one of our subject matter experts on ad tech, amongst many other things. I'm also hugely delighted to welcome Jared. Jared not only has been a significant partner, friend of the IAPP, he is the CEO and founder of TRU Staffing Partners. His insights, his expertise, and that of the TRU Staffing team have been so invaluable to this report. Salary, it's an issue that we all care about as privacy professionals. It's hugely important to organizations in their attraction and retention of professionals. It is something we've been tracking at the IAPP for a few years now. In a year of more, 2023 is definitely an inflection point year, I think, for increased workloads for the profession, increased law and policy around the world, increased complexity, risk, and enforcement risk around the world, not just in privacy, but in privacy adjacent areas. It is really important, increasingly important, to look at the key insights on how the market is behaving and responding to its ability to attract talent. Here on the screen are some key takeaways in our report. Unsurprisingly, just over 3/4 of respondents to our survey received a raise over the last year. This year's survey looked at not only cash compensation, but compensation across the board. So we looked at base salary, we looked at wider benefits and compensation. We're going to go into some of the particular and specific data points going on, but some of the other highlights just on this slide that I'd like to draw out is on the gender pay gap. Now, we know that there is a lot of work that remains to be done when it comes to the gender pay gap and gender equity in the workforce. The privacy profession has much to cheer and celebrate, and we'll dig into the data later on, but our data shows that female respondents to our survey earned 1% more on average in their base salaries than their male counterparts. If you're working in the US, you're more likely to earn more than your counterparts in Europe. And we're going to dig into the impact and the relationship between location and salary. This is the first salary survey and report that we have done since the pandemic. And there's a lot to be learned when it comes to location, not just with your geographic location and place in the world, but where you are doing your work from, and specifically how you are doing your work in the office or in home and what impact that has on your salary. And finally, we're going to look at the skills, the training, and the projection of all of that expertise in the form of certification and what impact that has on a professional's ability to command more money. My headline as we go into this and the introduction to the report and the foreword by Jared and Saz is that whilst historically salaries were paid in salt, hence the term salary coming from the Latin term, it's increasingly clear that privacy professionals deserve to be paid their weight in gold, not salt. And it's understandable given the mounting complexity and risk that professionals are dealing with, that their salaries are on the up, not just with base salary, but beyond. So let's kick off first with the gender equality data point. Now, there's definitely something to celebrate here. We've seen lots of reports recently, including from the United Nations, on gender equity, gender inequality, and gender in the workforce. Now, the privacy profession has, as I said, a lot to celebrate here because we are seeing that women in the workforce can and often are earning more than men. As a mean average of base salary, we can see here with the chart on the screen just how close it is between male and female earners. We are talking very small numbers, and we're actually seeing that women are earning almost 1% more than men. And I'm going to turn over to Saz just to dig into that. There, of course, is more to gender equity and gender inequality than pay, and there's, of course, more work to be done. But Saz, let me turn to you just to dig into these numbers in a little bit more detail, please.
Thanks, Joe. And it was particularly important again this year, as we've done in past years, to really look through this. And when we did so this year, we were able to do that both on base salary, but also look at overall compensation as well. And we'll definitely go into that in more detail later on in this presentation. The first point is one that we've highlighted several times, and it's that number around those who identified as female earning 1% more than male. And now this is when we compare average base and annual hourly. But the trend also persists if we look at overall compensation, with overall compensation calculated as averages for additional compensation data provided by respondents across areas such as bonus, long-term incentives, and pensions, just to include a few types. Here, we found that those who identified as female earned 2.3% more. And so this, it's showing that trend is there. And this all sounds great, particularly when we consider that on the overall basis, we had similar number of male and female respondents. So good news there too. I think whilst we should celebrate this, there's still some important considerations on gender that we shouldn't miss. And I think that's what we then dive into on the next slide when we look at this by role. I think what we highlighted in our report is that amongst our sample, female global CPOs and external privacy lawyers earn a greater base salary on average than their male counterparts across all surveyed roles. And this would have had an impact on the overall averages that we identified. And as we dive down into that breakdown by roles, we note that in certain roles, male respondents earn more than their female counterparts, privacy engineer and privacy analyst as an example. So that's something to keep in mind too. The other thing we pulled out in our report is that whilst we saw that 50-50 male-female representation in the overall sample, certain roles tended to have more male representation than others. And that's, again, something that we should bear in mind as we move forward and as we consider this and consider what we need to do next in this area. On the other hand, again, if we look for some good news here, we see that on the roles of Privacy Office Risk and Compliance Manager, Privacy Manager, and Privacy Analyst, there was greater female representation than male, suggesting that there's a pipeline of talent in place ready to help us continue to address those gender-related pay challenges.
Great, thank you, Saz. And Jared, I want to bring you in. Before I do, I just want to re-emphasize my thanks to you and the TRU Staffing Partners team for your partnership on this research. We're going to kick off, and I'll turn to you just to walk us through the insights in the report, your wider insights on location, location, location. And here, as I said at the outset, this is not just about somebody's physical placement geographically, it's about their placement and their physical location when comparing various roles. So please, let me turn to you to walk us through your key insights and headlines on this one.
Yeah, thanks for that great introduction, Joe, and for all the collaboration. You guys have just been amazing partners as well. And I think the research that we have gathered and that you have aggregated and analyzed is mostly really good news for privacy professionals, right? Just from a big picture perspective, this is really good news. I mean, the gender equality is great. We can celebrate that as a community. I think, we have a struggle of getting more technically minded women in any field, much less privacy and cybersecurity. And I think that's why we're seeing some of those discrepancies in those gender numbers there. We need more women wanting to get into STEM kind of work at an earlier age. That will, on a global level, help solve that problem because we see that discrepancy in all sorts of verticals. When we move to location, though, let's look at it in the two ways Joe said. The first is North America versus Europe. Why are US privacy pros making nearly 50% or more than their European counterparts? It's a really good question. And when we look at some of these other statistics, MT, like the greatest variation being at the privacy engineering level at nearly 100% plus gap. And then again, at the analyst level, almost 100% too. So the real question is why? Why? And there's a lot of why for this. The first of which is we don't have a level playing field when it comes to a regulatory environment here in the United States. We are a highly fractured regulatory environment. That fractured environment has created an environment in which a couple of things are occurring. One, people are looking for opportunities to leverage privacy to help the business, not just as a compliance responsibility, more so than a lot of European counterparts who perhaps do not do business in the United States. Now, if you're a company that's doing business everywhere, obviously you're going to have a bigger, more sophisticated privacy program and probably pay your people a higher salary. And we're going to get into that in a second. But I think what we can definitively see from this survey is that people in the United States, programs that are central to the United States, are using privacy talent for much more than a baseline GDPR compliance that creates a level playing field in Europe. And it reminds me, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, of e-discovery, which is another expertise that I have. And I remember when the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure came out in 2006, and then again in 2013. And what we saw happen then was more marginalizing of salary. And that marginalizing occurs for two reasons. One, there's a baseline of compliance that is required, but also more jobs get created. And I think we saw that happen in Europe over the last few years. A lot more jobs that paid less money because they were DPO, they were compliance only centric. And that set of skills is only a piece of the privacy equation when you look at some of the roles that are being hired for by similarly held titles in the United States. We can go on to the next piece, which I think is really interesting. And we just see here by role the discrepancies. And it's pretty standard, right? It's somewhere floating at that 50% or more level. You can see at the engineer level, it gets exacerbated pretty dramatically. But it's not like we're seeing any particular role in Europe that is somehow competing at the level with salaries in the United States, not even close. Now, when we switch the conversation, and this next part I think is the most interesting part, we've never had the kind of work from home revolution that we've experienced over the last 2 years. And this report sheds insights that are going to drive future hiring and job switching decisions for the next 10 to 20 years. This is maybe the most important data that is gathered in this whole survey from what is the new world order that we all live in? And what do we need to do as hiring managers and as job seekers to recalibrate to the new realities that people are working from home? These numbers are staggering. It is essentially telling us that 70% of people are working from home 3 days or more a week. 70%. 40% of that 70% fully remote, 5 days, and only 5% of people are in the office 5 days a week. And that's staggering. I mean, I would imagine if we did this survey from 17 to 19, we would see almost the reciprocal of this, would be my guess. We'd be seeing 70% of people in the office. The world has changed. Now, the question is, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of the challenges I may face looking for a job or trying to staff my privacy program or privacy consulting firm or law firm? Next slide, MT. When you break it down like this and you just think of things in black and white, 30% of people are going into an office more than 70% of people who are staying at home more, 3 days or more. What that essentially means is if you're looking to hire somebody and your policy is 3 days or more in an office, you're likely only going to get to look at 30% of the market. The likelihood that that 70% who's working from home 3 days a week or more will give that up for a job opportunity is highly unlikely. And if they are, their expectation in terms of being compensated for the time that it takes to commute, the cost of commuting, the cost of childcare associated with changing their schedules, All of that will be calculated in a job seeker's expectation, specifically in privacy. So when you think of it that way, here are some things from TRU data that we've garnered over the last 2 years that we found to be wildly important for hiring managers. The first of which is we found that if you switch your in-office requirement policy from 3 days in office a week to 2 days in office a week, you increase the amount of candidates that will look at your opportunity by nearly 50%. You drop that down again to only 2 days, 1 day a week in the office or no days a week, it'll increase by 100 to 150%. And those are metrics that we've been tracking on our end for the last 2 years. And the IAPP survey absolutely validates that, because the likelihood that these 70% of people are going into an office for a 7 to 10% increase, or even a 20% increase, or even a 40% increase in compensation is highly unlikely. The flexibility to work remotely from home is still the #1 job motivator in this industry and every other industry that we represent talent in. I'll pause there for a second in case Joe or Saz wants to jump in with any questions before we kind of look at North America versus Europe in terms of days.
Yeah, no, it's super important, empowering insights and research there. A lot there from the perspective of the hiring manager. Let's put ourselves in the position of the professional seeking out roles. And what advice or takeaways would you have for that professional looking for a role, knowing that salaries are on the up and that we have that breakdown? What advice would you give them with respect to the working from home if they want to position themselves so that they've got the deepest bench possible of opportunities and the best remunerated for their circumstances?
It's a great question. It's a complicated answer. Let me start by saying this. If your motivation is to work fully remote from home, you kind of missed the window. Those jobs are rarer now than they were the last 2 years as the whole world recalibrated. Now, the good news is there's still a lot of employers out there today that have fully remote cultures and job opportunities. They're just not in the same level of abundance that we saw over the last 2 years compared to people who have some sort of in-office requirement. Now, having said that, there are going to be a lot more people on a national level that are willing to hire remotely as the macroeconomy begins to improve. And so a job seeker who's motivated by working mostly or fully remotely from home has to now make their job search a national or global one for the rest of their life. This is a wildly new job search strategy, which, not to get self-promotional, is why you want a talent agent, because maneuvering through that massive ecosystem becomes immensely more complicated in terms of the amount of opportunities that will eventually become available, and also the amount of competition that you are also going to be up against. If it used to be you were hiring in your backyard, you're only up against other New Yorkers. After a while, you kind of get to know the privacy community in New York, and when a CPO job comes up, you kind of know who you might be up against. Not anymore. Now you're up against a national talent pool potentially, especially at more of a mid-level market, less so at maybe an executive level. And so your opportunities are going to be more vast, but so is your competition. Conversely, if you're a job seeker who says, I'm willing to go into an office 5 days a week, I'm willing to go into an office 4 days a week, 3 days a week, I'd love that actually, get me out of the house, you now become a prized job seeker in today's market, because as you can see, there is a finite amount of people who are in or willing to come into an office. So if that's you, you become very valuable to a potential employer. And now is a fantastic time for you to be looking for a job move and using the sensitivity that employers have about making people come into an office to negotiate the highest possible compensation. Do I think 3 years from now, you'll be able to say, hey, look, you're making me come into an office, I need to be paid more? I don't know. Today, absolutely.
Super interesting. Well, let's dig into the regional angle. And a question's just come in that's worth bearing in mind as we go through the key differences between North America and Europe. And I think to paraphrase that question, to what extent are we seeing the privacy profession just reflect a broader cross-industry trend here and differences of salary? Or are we seeing something quite specific and unique to the privacy profession across the region? So just have that in the back of your mind as we go through this sort of regional split between North America and Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, we're seeing something very different. I think companies that are global or in these places and others, specifically and others, are looking for people with a wild set of diverse regulatory experience and or exposure and or desire, and also the ability to manage legal operations, technical in a harmonious way, whether it's hands-on or consultative. And the more you lean towards more North America, the more you have employers asking for talent that has all of that stuff rolled into one human being, even if it's, you know, one at the top and five underneath, but we want them all to be able to have a little bit of that before we begin to compartmentalize our talent ecosystem. That's going to mean higher compensations for all of those people that touch upon all of those skill sets. Conversely, and this is good and bad news maybe for hiring managers and job seekers, if you're a specialist, meaning you're one of the best privacy engineers in the game, you can also command higher compensation by going really deep in a specific area. The volume of opportunities that might be available to you by being a specialist might be more narrow than by being a generalist, but there's going to be opportunities for all of those people in North America in greater abundance, paying higher salaries than in Europe, simply because there are more companies in North America living in this fractured regulatory ecosystem where there's opportunity is as important as compliance, but also they're more globally centric in terms of how they do business. And the volume of privacy jobs in Europe that I think attributes to these lower salary numbers has to be attributed to a lot of companies that are not doing business in other areas that are regulated by things other than GDPR. And GDPR creates a nice, even playing field for a company to say, we're compliant in Europe.
Great, thanks very much, Jared. So those are some of the key location differences. Let's roll on to the next slide. And here we're talking about the speed of hire for privacy. Some really interesting insights here, Jared. Please walk us through this.
Thank you, Joe. So this is true data. And what's important when you look at this is how long until a job seeker that you're interviewing is entertaining multiple offers. And between 2021 and 22, we found that most privacy job seekers had a minimum of 3 offers by the time that they took a job, and an average, a minimum of 2 and an average of 3, meaning people were either getting counter offers or multiple offers. So if you're a hiring manager, this is what we're looking at in terms of temporal timeline before you might lose a candidate, right? And this also kind of indicates how long it takes to fill a job. Now, what's amazing about these timelines is that they're nearly half to a third of what life was like before the pandemic. And this is what we think the new norm will be, and what we see in the Q2 2023, 90 days for an executive, 45 for mid-market, and 10 to 14 days for a contractor. What's amazing about this is if you are hiring remote, expect these timelines to truncate, right? So if you're hiring fully remote, you're going to have more people to look at, and you're going to be able to interview them faster because you're going to get the candidates more quickly and feel like you have a corpus of resumes to consider that you can move on quickly. There's incredible demand and not enough supply of remote jobs today. Now, a year ago, totally different, right? You put your hand up, I want to work remote. You've got 3 offers in less than 30 days, 35 days in Q3 of 2022. That's how fast the market moved. It's slowed down a little bit, but not a lot, which means it's still very competitive. What I think is important to keep in mind here is if your job search is taking, if your interview process is taking longer than this, you're going to keep losing people, right? You're going to get them to the end of your interview process and you're going to lose them. And then you're going to start this cycle over again. And all of a sudden you're finding yourself taking, instead of 90 days to fill a CPO spot, it's taking 270 because you're restarting because it takes you too long to get through your process. Or a privacy program manager or director, it takes you 90 days to make a decision. Well, people are making decisions halfway through your process and exiting the process. That's why this data is so important for hiring managers, and we wanted to include it here. And it is very relevant to working remotely from home versus in office. In office takes longer.
Very interesting. Time is of the essence. So look, with that in mind, I'm going to move us on to the next theme: industry, industry, industry. So it's not just a homogenous industry, the privacy profession. There are industries within that and particular sectors. And our report generates those cuts, and it's important to look at those cuts of data. And we've got the means and the median averages up on the screen here. Saz, I'm going to turn to you just to unpack the importance and the variance between the different industries and what that means for salary.
Thanks, Joe. In a way, what we have on screen is a somewhat logical relationship. Larger organizations by revenue or by number of employees tended to pay more than the smallest organizations. And so our data showed that privacy pros working for organizations with under 100 million of annual revenue reported base salaries 35% lower than privacy pros working at organizations with more than $40 billion in annual revenue. And it's the same sort of relationship when we look at it from employee size as well, with organizations with less than 100 employees reporting 28% lower average base salaries against those working in organizations with more than 80,000 employees. And it's worth noting, I think, that this doesn't give us too much detail, and there's more detail on page 6 of our report where we go into how it varies by role, by organizational size. But I think actually there's more to look at in industry. And I think, Jared, we were speaking about one of the key points around critical factors that you're seeing in market that actually might impact salary as well, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, so we've got these charts here. I'll give everyone a second to let your eyes try to ingest this, but I'll go from the top left-hand corner and work my way across. The top left-hand corner is essentially, what Saz in the report says. If you're a big company with a huge staff, what we add here are two variables to this equation that I think are what determine compensation ranges for companies. One of them is regulatory scrutiny, and the other is how they use data. So this first example is a big company, lots of staff, high regulatory scrutiny. They're using lots of data. They're going to pay their privacy people more money. Example number 2 actually looks the same. What it should say is small staff. So you could have a big revenue company, but have a small privacy program, high regulatory scrutiny, high degree of data usage, higher salaries. What's interesting here is you could be a very small company. You could be a $10 million company, small privacy program, but have extremely high regulatory risk, extremely high usage of data. Maybe you are in the business of aggregating data. You're going to pay your privacy people more money. Now, here's an interesting example. Huge company, huge staff, not a lot of regulatory scrutiny, and they're not using the data a lot. They're not going to pay their privacy people a lot of money. And this example is a real example of a company that we represent that's in the Fortune top 50. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you're at a big company, you're going to make more money. And we have a lot of candidates that come to us that say, I only want to look at Fortune 50 companies. I only want to look at Fortune 100 companies. The problem with that is that doesn't necessarily equal maturation of privacy program and higher compensation. And you have to look at all these variables. There's some really exciting opportunities that pay really good money at companies who are in the business of data. And as we move into this AI age that we are moving into, which is a whole other conversation, I don't want us to spiral there, but we're going to see the companies that specialize in the use and permissiveness of data paying more money for privacy people to help them not only maneuver in building products and in staying compliant, but in also lobbying to make sure regulations don't prohibit the expansiveness of their use of that data, and the ability to harmonize ethics and opportunity is going to be a big, big ticket item in terms of compensation acceleration 5-10 years from now for privacy professionals who are thinking that far ahead in terms of their evolution. So it's just a fun way to rethink. It's not, bigger doesn't always mean more money.
I'm thinking, Jared, just to jump in, that a privacy professional might want to look at those companies that have the regulators knocking at their door for enforcement, those companies that are in the courts, those companies that are getting the fines, that
or
regulatory risk. Yeah, and perhaps they're whether it's drinking from the fire hose or because there's high regulatory risk, or because those companies are data companies, they're data intensive organizations. That's where the salary is. That's where the money is.
100%. So this is a really interesting breakdown. We produced a report last year and had an update this year of the salaries that we're seeing, and our data, this is maybe the most important thing I'll say today. Our data, which is in blue, is the point of hire data, meaning that when someone actually hires a new employee, these are the ranges based on industry that we're seeing customers pay. And I'll be honest, not much has changed too much in terms of dollars and cents since 2022. So the market today is more or less the same, maybe inching up a little bit. The IAPPs are very different. This data is based on what people say they're making right now. And what you'll see here in this underlined blue is that the bottom of our range is pretty much what the mean is in the survey. This tells me that all of our data is very accurate and very right. Because if somebody's actually making $89,000, $90,000 a year, they're gonna want more to move, right? And what we're seeing in the market is anywhere from 10 to 40% increases in comp, which we're going to talk about in a second. And that's what these ranges reflect. They reflect somewhere about a 10 to 40% increase in comp. If you're making 100, you could bump up to 130, 140, depending on the industry vertical you're in. If you look down at privacy counsel, again, very similar, right? Our bottom line ranges are pretty much in line with the mean salaries of what people are making right now. The reason why this slide is so important is job seekers obviously know they want to make more money when they change jobs. And we'll give you some data on how much you can expect, whether it's a raise or a switch in position to a different company in terms of increase in compensation. But hiring managers need to understand this, particularly in a down macro economy, because there's a lot of old school thinking that in a down economy, I'm going to be able to go get people who are out of work to take less money than they were making to come work for me because they're out of work. And I'm here to tell you, privacy pros are not going to do that. They don't need to do that, and they don't want to do that. And there are opportunities for them out there that will help them pay more. And a lot of them are below market because in the last 2 years, salaries have increased, according to our data, between 22 and 40% at the point of hire. But according to this data, up to 10%. And we'll see that in a second. So when you see these ranges and you see dissonance between them, think of it that way. It's not like our data is incongruent. We're looking at different data. We're looking at point of hire data versus what people are making right now. So this is true data in terms of where are the jobs, like who's hiring. 80% at corporations, programs being built, 15% in consulting firms, and 5% at law firms. We've seen a big deceleration in attorney staffing within practice groups at law firms. That happened back at GDPR 18 to 20. I think law firms probably had 25% of this pie back then. And I think consulting firms had another 25% of this pie back then, because I think so many corporations were leaning on external resources, a lot still are, to do that work. Now, they may still be leaning on them to that degree, but I don't know that the external consultant, actually I do know, the external consultant are not hiring at the same volume that they were 2 years ago. And certainly the corporations are hiring in nearly twice to 3 times the volume. So corporations are really committed to building programs. That's where most of these jobs are going to be over the next couple of years.
So I'm going to bring Saz in on this slide. So some of the questions we're getting in the chat, and we'll come on to some of the specifics in the Q&A section. All right, what can I do? I'm a professional. What can I do to boost my prospects of securing a job that pays well, pays better than perhaps I'm earning at the moment? And in a space where, and you covered it really well, Jared, around risk, regulatory risk. The corollary of that is regulatory knowledge and being well equipped to navigate this sort of alphabet soup and complexity of risk and regulation in the market, around the global markets. So Saz, let me turn to you around some of the insights that we collected here on certification.
Thanks, Joe. And one way I wanted to start the section was start at the top, and we collected some interesting demographic insights from our respondents. And our respondents continue to bring a wide variety of qualifications to the table, and it's something I wanted to highlight. The first of those is that 95% of our respondents has reported having some degree level qualifications. 42% had a law degree, and 31% had a postgraduate degree. So coming into the survey, we've got a lot of qualified people, got a lot of people with experience as well, and we'll come on to that again later in this presentation. Our survey also identified how our respondents continue to pursue privacy qualifications, and that's what we're seeing on screen here, those certifications held by role. Our data identified that 77% of surveyed respondents had at least one IAPP qualification, while 37% had multiple. And then if we look at that by role, global CPOs were more likely than those in other roles to hold both any IAPP qualification and any certified information privacy professional qualification. So that's everything kind of from CIP-A all the way through to CIP-US and CIP-G, which is really interesting and paints an interesting picture of that role. So in a crowded market, for those wanting to differentiate themselves from their peers, pursuit of those qualifications might offer that opportunity to do so. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that actually, if we look at this graph and look at some of the data in the report as well, the Fellow of Information Privacy designation might be one area where there is more of a chance to differentiate yourself, where there's not as many who have achieved that designation yet, but actually a bit of a link between that designation and a higher salary. That designation is only held by 30% of surveyed global CPOs, dropping down to around 6% of surveyed privacy managers. And if we move on to the next slide, we see that when we look at base salary, the data shows that a respondent with any one qualification earned just over 13% more than those with no IAPP qualification. And those with multiple IAPP qualifications earned just over 27% more than those with no qualification. So we're really starting to see the value of potential value of those qualifications that are represented in salary numbers. And then if you start to think about the specific combinations, whether that's CIPP and CIPM or CIPP and CIPT and kind of the variables that you can get there, those combinations actually earned those individuals 20% more than their peers with only one qualification. So again, we're starting to see the benefits of maybe the pursuit of additional further qualifications to really kind of differentiate itself, consolidate and show that experience and be able to show that through qualifications. The report dives into this further, and there's more highlights there, including across the types of roles that we surveyed as well. So if you want to look at that against your role, there's the opportunity to do so.
But also add anecdotally that we are definitely seeing a significant increase in hiring managers who come to us that essentially require a CIPP, maybe multiple depending on geographic region, and sometimes also a CIPM before they'll even interview a candidate. So, that's not the bulk of the market, but it is happening with more scrutiny that I would say, at a certain point, it'll be an easy way for a company that maybe doesn't know privacy and doesn't have a privacy champion at all, and this is who they're hiring, to lean on the IAPP certification as a way for them to satisfy okay, we know this person knows their stuff. And it is the gold standard. It's not just lip service. It will make you earn more money, and it will make you rise to the top of a pile of resumes against peers that don't have these certifications.
Yeah, really important takeaways, especially in a market where expertise is an increasingly king commodity, and it can be quite challenging to project that expertise. So certification is one easy way to project it. The letters after one's name is a very transparent, clear, accessible way to say, yes, I adhere to and I have the expertise as verified, authorized by the IPP and by others. Let's roll on to the next section. So fight or flight. So Chad, I'm going to turn over to you here, but what we're talking about here is the best way in which a professional can get a pay rise. If they're in an organization and they're thinking, do I stick here and I fight here, or do I twist and seek opportunities elsewhere? And what's more likely to result in a positive outcome for that individual?
Yeah, so we could go into a whole other webinar about how to go about asking for a raise. Let's not go down that rabbit hole today, but let's talk about what it would mean, what expectations hiring managers and job seekers should have when asking for a raise. Because one of the biggest problems that we experience is that candidates come to us and they're asking, well, I'm going to go ask my boss for a 50% raise. And you're like, oh my gosh, like, please don't do that. You're not going to get it. And it's going to position you as somebody that doesn't understand the economics of your compensation or the industry at large. So here's data that gives Privacy Pro some very clear indicators as to how many people got raises and how much of a raise they got over 2 years, in which, in my mind, a lot of people got raises, as we can see here. 76% have got raises over the last 12 months, right? That's a lot of privacy people. That's over 1,000 people that took the survey, got a raise. And we can see that some people more so than others, right? If you have subject matter expertise, like a privacy champion or a guru that is niche, you might have gotten a bigger raise, because to replace you if you left would cost significantly more money. And so you saw a lot of people getting raises in order to retain talent in a market during 21 and 22, where we estimate a third to half of all privacy job seekers switch jobs, maybe 2/3, right? If for no other reason, the work from home debacle, much less opportunism and a million other reasons that they switched positions. And they were switching them fast, which means the faster they switch, the more opportunities become open, the more they have to backfill. And, we talked about all this. Here you can really see how many people got raises. And if we go to the next slide, this is an inflection point. Between 19 and 21, people at the same survey only got a 3% raise, right? These are the pandemic years. We're in the middle of the pandemic. We're all just lucky and thankful we had a job. But hey, good news, Privacy Pros, you still managed to get a 3% raise as a community during the worst economic year in the last 10 to 20 years. Now, the rebound after, you saw this huge inflection point. We've gone from 3% to 7% over the last 2 years. That's a 10% increase since 2019 in salaries. That's really significant, and compared to other industries is wildly high. That's the good news. Between 21 and 23, they doubled the amount of raise that they got. Privacy Pros obviously are highly valued. Their experience offers dramatic increase. But how does that compare to switching companies? And if we go to the next slide, you're going to see a little data. We can click through these quickly, MT. Okay, 9%, 3%, 7 to 10%. If you don't want to switch jobs, if you love your company, but you just need more money, go ask for a 7 to 10% raise. You can point to this survey and say, that's what people are getting. That's what the industry's getting. I really need it. I don't want to look for a job. I need a raise. Now, as a job seeker, you can only do that once. So be sure when you ask for it, you're going to be happy with it and settled with the decision if you get what you're asking for. On the flip side, if you don't, or you don't want to stay at your company, or you want significantly higher than 7 to 10% increase in raise, which you may not get in the next 2 years, which are going to be very different than the last 2 years. Next slide. This is true data. Over the last 2 years, same years that this survey was taken, the average increase from what a person was making in base compensation to what they accepted when they took a job was at a minimum at 22% raise and a maximum 40%. There is no question that a privacy professional is going to make more money if they switch jobs than if they ask for a raise. That doesn't mean that you should switch jobs. It just means that over the last 2 years, if you moved, you are now making a lot more money than you were. That may mean there's less jobs available to you now because you're making a lot more money. The more money you make, the less jobs are going to be available. We're going to talk about that in a second. I don't know that you're going to see 22 to 40% increases over the next 2 years, but I also don't think you're going to see 7 to 10% increases in raises over the next 2 years. I think most people should be anticipating not getting raises this year. It is going to be a very down macro year for the entire global economy, and people are laying people off more than they are hiring in droves the way they were over the last 2 years. So we have to look at this data as not what is now, but what was the last 2 years. And I'm here to tell everybody that having lived through recruitment in the dot-com bust, 9/11, Great Recession, and now COVID, the pendulum swing in terms of rebound was like 7 to 10 years. Post-pandemic, it's 18 months. And we've seen that, right? From 20 to 21, 22, and now here we are at 23 in terms of volume of opportunity, in terms of people changing jobs, in terms of people getting hired versus fired. Guess what, guys? Give it 6 more months, maybe less, and you're going to see things start to swing back. So that doesn't mean now's not a great time to look for jobs. It depends on why you're looking. And if you're looking for a 20 to 40% increase in compensation, depending on who you are, you might be better getting that in another 3 to 6 months than you may get it right now. If you're looking for a raise at 10%, you might want to ask for it next year, not at the end of this year. This is just a look of data now as we start to break into who's getting these crazy increases in comp, who's getting these 20, 40%. When you look at what the survey says, it says that most people that are filling out this survey have around 6 years experience, right? And then if you look at this pie chart for 10 years or less, or let's call it not less, 3 to 10 years experience, that's north of 50% of this pie, right? Now go to the next slide. This is true data. This is the inflection point on that 22 to 40% increases based on years of experience. So this is what this data tells us. If you've got 3 to 6 years experience, that's who's getting the 40% increases in raises. That's where there's extreme demand for talent and not enough supply. So as you as a privacy pro hit that inflection point of 3 to 6 years, somewhere in there, you should probably be thinking about, do I want to spend another 3 to 6 years at this employer, or do I want to take the opportunity of knowing my value has a high degree of increase in compensation at this moment in time because of demand and supply? And we see this being pretty consistent for the next several years, right? Maybe it'll expand to 3 to 7 to 8 years as more opportunity becomes available and more sophistication is required. Now, if you're a CPO, don't expect a 40% increase in compensation. You're not going to get it. You're going to get 12 to 18 is what our data is telling us based on people switching jobs. And this is base. This is base, not total, base, right? So I hope this is helpful. The other data point that I think is really fascinating here, and I know we have a few more things we want to talk about, so I'm going to talk quickly. If you're looking to break into privacy and you've got 0 experience or 0 to 1 year's experience, you may take a pay cut. That's what our data is telling us. So people that are moving from security, moving from governance, moving from e-discovery and moving into privacy, who've never, maybe they got their CIPP or CIPM, but they've never applied it to a job they've actually worked, but they've committed to going in that direction. Be prepared to take potentially a 10% pay cut in order to get in. The good news is in 3 years, you can jump back up 30 to 40%. And then I think this is Saz can talk about this. This is pretty self-evident. And we laughed about this because it's like, yeah, everybody wants to be paid in cash.
Yeah, I was going to just go this through this really quickly. I think it's an obvious one. But actually, I think what I wanted to highlight was for the first time this year, we asked in a lot more detail about additional compensation in our survey. So if you are thinking about bonus, long-term incentives, pension contributions, other factors other than base salary, there's a lot of data in the report that I think could be really useful to look at. Of that, we talk about in the report how we found that nearly 8 in 10 respondents received a raise in the previous 12 months, which is a rise from the 6 in 10 that received one in the 2021 survey, and nearly 7 in 10 receive a bonus. So there's a lot of additional data there if you want to dive in and kind of benchmark yourself and look for more.
Excellent. So those are great insights on the sort of the state of the state, looking back and where the market is at the moment. What I'd like to ask you both is what's coming next? Because I know we've been giving this a lot of thought in future iterations of insights like this. We've trailed some of the sort of macro and the micro and the market trends, but what's coming next? What can professionals expect down the pike over the next few months and years?
Yeah, look, I think we're seeing a lot of people still getting laid off in privacy. That's just a reality. I don't think we've seen the end of layoffs. I think we will probably see the end of that in early Q3 and a pretty quick inflection point of aggressive staffing to rebuild. Keep in mind, a lot of publicly traded companies, regardless of what continent they trade on, have been firing people for the last 6 months. And so when they get their quarterly earnings reports and they go public with those, and they see inflections in stock price and in revenue generation and growth or profitability, they're going to go back to hiring people, right? So we have to sort of watch these macroeconomic conditions to anticipate, particularly the tech sector, which hires a lot of people and fires a lot of people in privacy, what to expect in terms of the volume of staffing. This, I think, is a really complex and heady thing, and I want to leave room for questions, so I won't get on too much of a soapbox, but I think we have to anticipate that privacy is going to experience consolidation and commoditization. This is a long-term thing to think about, both in terms of regulatory consolidation and commoditization, and a software ecosystem of consolidation and commoditization. Right now, there's an 800-pound gorilla in terms of software companies, and then we're tracking 650 other tech companies that are somehow in the privacy space. I remember when there were 650 e-discovery tools that were trying to solve all the e-discovery problems. Now there are like 5. And what we're going to see in privacy over the next 10 to 15 years is a consolidation. Those companies will buy each other. Some won't last. Some will rise. Some will surprise you that rise. And there will be consolidation. When that consolidation happens and that commoditization happens in the software side, it will make it easier for hiring managers to have a level playing field for technology skill sets with which to hire from. Meaning right now, there is not a standard pool of people that know all 650 different tools. Privacy hiring managers are still, from a technology standpoint, building their own or having to teach people whatever third-party software they've chosen to integrate, unless it's the 800-pound gorilla that there's a certain reservoir of people available, but that's not everybody. So as that consolidation occurs, we're going to see more jobs that are specifically looking for tech skill sets. So if you don't have tech skill sets and you're early in your career, I get them now, right? I get as many of them as you can and hedge your bets to see which will be the 5 that conglomerate and survive. The same goes for regulatory, and we touched on this earlier. If there was a federal law in the United States, you would immediately see more privacy jobs become available at a lower compensation, because it would force everyone that's avoiding staffing for privacy to have to hire someone for privacy. And that would be great for the business, but it will bring down this sense of, oh, well, everyone in privacy is having these kind of accelerating salary experiences. We might actually see a conglomerate dip in comp, but an increase in volume of opportunity. Now, that's not going to change for a while. I'm not a believer that we're going to see federal legislation in this administration, particularly if this administration goes another. And if they don't, I really don't think we're going to see any legislation. That's just my opinion at a federal level for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is a fractured environment creates opportunity for accelerated earning potential for the professionals in it. And right now, we are highly fractured, both in terms of software and in terms of regulation in the United States. And that's why salaries are so high. This last part is just, we see people are like, Jared, I got to pay more money just to get people. I got to pay 20% more for someone with 6 years or more. The other option is flex your work from home policies, because if you're someone that's trying to hire 3 days a week or more in an office, if you downgrade that, you will have significantly more people available who might be willing to take lower compensations now that the work from home flexibilities have changed. And I think we'll see more people use that to attract talent. Switching jobs, in my opinion, is absolutely going to mean more compensation, maybe even more so, because I think people are not going to be getting very large raises over the next 2 years unless they are really standing out in the crowd at their company. And I think I touched on this. I don't know if you guys want to touch on this last point, but we're moving to that ecosystem where certifications are being required for job seekers as opposed to a nice thing to have.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a different point, and there's a question from one of our listeners on this. Switching jobs. Now, let's dig into that. Are we talking about switching company, or are we also thinking about switching jobs within the organization? Something you said earlier related to the key differences between the US and the EU has stuck with me. And to paraphrase, you're saying in the United States, because of the fragmented nature, part of the role is focused on data utilization. It's not only a compliance exercise, it's advising the organization how you can provide them with insights to make better use of what data they have on the stocks already. Now, some roles may be emerging in industry within companies that are closer to data utilization than compliance, and folks might want to consider moving into those jobs or trying to if they're being entrepreneurial, articulate extra responsibility for that more business focused angle. But I wanted to dig into the switching jobs point. I mean, can this also extend to advocating for more responsibility within an organization, or a different job altogether in an organization? What are you seeing here?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that with the way I think the listeners want to hear it and how the question was asked, which is, if you are moving from a role in one company into a privacy role and don't have experience doing privacy, I think you're going to be challenged to try to equivocate what you should be paid to what somebody in that role at another company is currently being paid. And I see that from job seekers, right? Like, I have no privacy experience, but they want me to take this privacy engineering job. Well, this is what privacy engineers are getting paid, so I need to get paid that. And yeah, I know it's $70,000 more than what I'm making, but that's what they get paid. That argument is a tough one for employers, and I don't think you're going to win. They're investing in you and transitioning you and letting you reinvent yourself in the company. I'd be asking for the 7 to 10% raise, maybe more so than a 40% increase that equivocates salary to role as a kind of apples to apples comparison. Now, having said that, if you're in a privacy role and you're asking for more experience, or you're getting promoted up into a role in the program, that's the time to leverage this salary data, as this is what people are making in this job, and this is what people are making in terms of increases if they move out of this job into another one, right? Our two data points. That's the appropriate time to use that data. You might be wildly underpaid because you've spent the last 7 years at the same employer and you don't want to leave, but you need that raise. Now's the time to advocate for that. But let's differentiate vertical mobility from horizontal transition. Yeah?
Really helpful. We could talk about this not just for days, but for weeks on end, not least because the environment within that the profession operates within is moving. The regulatory environment, the economic environment, and the personnel environment, and the requirements and the desires that they have. I am going to turn to you both for some closing remarks and reflections. We've picked up some questions along the way, so please do share your final thoughts, reflections, maybe a data point that you found most interesting or surprising, perhaps, and then I will thank you both. Saz, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, sure. I think one that I found most, not necessarily surprising, but comforting, knowing that I'm working with such people, is that 86% of people were satisfied with their roles, and it's comforting and uplifting to know that, you know, you work with people who are happy with what they do. They're excited by privacy and they want to do that. So I enjoyed that statistic a lot from the report. But at the same time, it was interesting to contrast that with another table in the report which talks about kind of the motivations for privacy pros to move jobs, and 72% identified that if they got a pay increase they would move. I think corroborating some of what we talked about today. So there's contrasting statistics there and data points there, but interesting nonetheless.
Super interesting. Jared, over to you. Things that surprised you, reflections, data points that you thought were most interesting or impactful.
Well, I'll start with the surprises, and they're good caveats to give to people. I mean, when we look at the average salary for a chief privacy officer in this survey, it says it's something hovering around, I think, $200 and something thousand. I mean, I haven't placed a chief privacy officer in a job for less than $275, maybe $300, in maybe 4 years. So I don't think that salary data is always what people should turn to if you're a hiring manager to say, like, this is what I should pay a CPO, right? Like, this is what they're making. You're going to have to pay people more than what they're making to get them to leave their job. And this last point made by Saz and Joe is the crystallization of that, right? If you pay me more money, I'll leave. So we know that money is a driver for people, that will continue to be a driver for people for the next several years. And it's a great time to be a privacy professional. I'll close with one last thought, Joe, which is I think that everyone has to understand that the pace of things changes in the job market. And the pace of things right now is dramatically different than the pace and volume of what we saw over the last 2 years. And as I said, that pace won't last forever. And I think this community needs to be prepared for a revolution in 2024, where we see an explosion of opportunities in jobs and privacy as AI now becomes real and an integration as opposed to an innovation. as regulatory environments become more complex, not less. I'm of the mind we'll see 50 state regulations before we see a federal one. And that, for better or for worse, is really good for business. So enjoy being part of this really exciting community. I enjoy it. And I'll say this, it's the warmest, most welcoming community. So if you're looking to reinvent or looking to define what your career can be, get into privacy.
I will second your comments. I'll third those of Saz's. Thank you to all of our listeners, viewers today. This webinar will be on the IAPP website afterwards, so you can come back to it if you want to pick up some of the insights that we walked through, or if you'd like to share it to others as well. The survey and the report itself are also on the website, so please do take a look at the data that's in there. There's a lot of data that we couldn't and we didn't have the time to cover today, so please do look at that. Saz and Jared and the teams were delighted to keep up the conversation, to keep up this work. We'll be keeping a close eye on the trends, the developments. We here in the IAPP, of course, not only do we care about the profession, but we're here to support the profession as professionals first and foremost, and that includes how professionals are within the market and within the community. So thank you to everyone who's listening. Huge thanks to Saz and to Jared and the wider TRU Staffing Partners team. It's been a pleasure moderating this discussion. I look forward to future discussions like this and future collaborations. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your mornings. If it's morning, enjoy the rest of your afternoons. And if it's your evening, have a great evening. Take care.